Hey guys, Libby here, and it is the end of the first month of 2015. That was fast. This month I read 8 novels, 2 short stories, 1 work of nonfiction, and listened to 3 audiobooks for a resounding 14 books, which is more than I read in all of 2013. So, go me. Also, I have upped my Goodreads challenge from 50 to 70, partially because I was like 12 books ahead of schedule. Also, on a slightly more trivial note, I was getting tired of having that percentage bar just say like 2%, 4%, 6%, going up by even twos. I wanted some more interesting percentages, and now I have those. I also had quite an enjoyable reading month. It wasn't stellar. 7 of the 14 books were 4 or 5 stars, no 1 stars, and then 7 2 or 3 stars. But most of those were the short fiction or the stuff that I knew I wasn't going to like anyway, but I still read. So let's get right down to it. The first book I read, I don't know if we're going to count this as reading in January of 2015. I read like 95% of it in December of 2014, but I finished it like just after midnight, which means it counts for this year, you guys. Anyway, cheating aside, this is Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister by Gregory Maguire. This was part of the winter rereadathon that I was doing, so this was a reread for me, and I liked it better than the first time I read it. I read it when I was like 14 or 15, and it was too much for me. Not from a writing style, but from a content perspective. There's like implications of pedophilia and really creepy old ladies. And when I was 14, I could not deal. And while these things still aren't like good, they are not shocking to me anymore. So I was able to read this and enjoy it more than I did the first time. Also, I like completely misremembered some stuff from the epilogue. So I thought that some people who do get together don't get together. So for the whole book, I was like, no, guys, this is gonna end poorly. But then it doesn't end poorly. So that was a nice surprise. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The next book is also one that I started in 2014, also as part of the rereadathon. So another reread. This book is amazing. It's Under the Skin by Michel Faber. I will maybe move my hand off the title. This book got 5 out of 5 stars. I love it with a fiery passion, and you need to read it. It was... I don't know if it was better than the first time I read it, because I read this one I also read a really long time ago, but it was definitely just as good. And also I forgot like what Amleth Vess is all about. So if you know what I'm talking about, you'll know that he's kind of important in his philosophies. And this is the book that I would most highly recommend that I read this month. Moving over here, the next book was The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, which I started during the rereadathon and continued and finished during Bout of Books 12. This is the first book in the Discworld series, which I am trying to read all 40 books this year, so it was good to get started. This was another reread. I didn't love it the first time. I loved it slightly more the second time, but still only 2 stars. I also did a full video review of this book along with its sequel, The Light Fantastic, which you can click on if you so choose. Next up was my nonfiction book, What If, which has a really long subtitle, Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions by Randall Munroe, aka the XKCD guy. This book I gave 3 stars because some of the questions I found interesting and I wanted to know the answers to. Some of them I didn't. I guess that's to be expected since he covers a really broad range of topics from like anthropology to geology to physics. I'm pretty much just interested in geology and maybe a little bit physics. I cared less about anthro and chemistry and biology, and some of it was just weird. And it was sort of not sure how humorous to be, so the jokes were kind of hit and miss. I definitely learned some stuff, so I guess I'm glad I read it, but I'm not going to reread it probably going to get unhauled unless my partner wants it. So 3 out of 5 stars for What If. Next up, I read the e-book of Transcendence by Shay Savage. I quite enjoyed this book. It was a romance novel from the man's perspective, which is something that I have not read before. It gives you all the feels the way a romance novel should. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because although I liked most of it, there was a time travel aspect that didn't really make sense. I couldn't picture the mechanics and it wasn't really explained, and I don't know how well it would have worked to have it explained. And I make it sound worse than it is. Part of this was that it gets explained in the epilogue, so I still had like 250 pages of building up. This doesn't make sense. Why are you gonna tell me about this, Shay Savage? And then she did at the end, and I was like, okay, but I've still been thinking those thoughts for so long that they've just created a meme in my head. And even the epilogue didn't completely solve everything, so I think 4 out of 5 is fair. Next up, I listened to the audiobook, but I also own a physical copy of Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This book was so good. I've read several other Thomas Hardy books. He is my favorite 19th century author. Charlotte Bronte, though. He's my favorite male 19th century author. And I had seen 2 of the 3 recent, last 40 years, film adaptations. And this really had an element that I didn't see in either of them. The ones I had seen were the 2008 BBC adaptation with Gemma Arterton and the 1998 London Weekend Television, probably, version with Justine Waddell. Not the Roman Polanski version, because just no. But anyway, there's this whole, like, subtext that is a criticism of Christianity for being hypocritical and unfeeling, which didn't come across in the movies, and is really, I think, the core point of the story. The message that I got from the films was that the way society deals with rape victims, particularly in this time period, can be worse than the rape itself. But in the book, he makes it really clear that it's because of all of the Christian hypocrisy that we treat rape victims the way we do. So this book is also highly recommended if you're in the mood for something serious and not at all fun, but I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next up was The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett, the second book in the Discworld series. Since it got a full review with The Color of Magic, suffice it to say 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished was another Thomas Hardy audiobook. I got kind of in the mood for some Hardy after Tess of the D'Urbervilles, so I continued with his happy first novel, Under the Greenwood Tree. No one died in it. It was lovely. Anyway, I did listen to it for free on LibriVox. I will provide a link to the version I listened to if you would like to listen to it as well. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars just because there isn't that much content. The plot, there's sort of 2 plots. One is a love story between like a teacher who's educated and middle class and a poorer tranter's son. And then the tranter and some of the other village people make up the church choir, and the vicar is attempting to replace the old sort of rustic church choir with this fancy new harmonium or piano type instrument for the church music. So it's a very small story, and I feel like you don't really need to read it because it's very nostalgic and trying to show the everyday lives of the people in this type of small town that Thomas Hardy grew up in. But you can get that vibe from pretty much any of his other novels, and they also like have a more interesting plot. The next thing that I read was the short story Homecoming by Clare Legrand. It is a sequel short story, or more like an epilogue, to Winterspell, which I read back in like October. And I gotta say, I am not happy that it happened. Winterspell, the novel, already had like a 2 years later epilogue, so I feel like we tied things up sufficiently. It wasn't super tied up, and so there was room for a epilogue short story, but I'm just fine with not everything being as tied up as is humanly possible. I read the series of unfortunate events. I can handle loose ends. So I just found Homecoming really unnecessary, and she didn't do anything wrong, which is why it's not a 1 out of 5 stars, but it just, why? So the plot is, it's several years later, different numbers of years for both of our romantic interests, and we're like, are they still gonna love each other and blend the way they did? And I'm like, yeah, of course they are. Now, if you want to write an epilogue short story where the two people that we wanted to be together were like, oh, we actually don't like each other that much anymore, that would have been cool. I would have read that. It would have made so many people angry, though. So, Homecoming, why did you happen? You get 2 stars. Next up was Sourcery, the 3rd book in the Discworld series. Well, it's the 3rd book in the Rincewind sub-series. It's like the 7th book or something in the Discworld series as a whole, but I'm reading it by sub-series. Are you confused yet? So this was another reread that I liked more than I remembered liking. Pleasant surprise. Pretty solidly interesting villain. Terry Pratchett is pretty good with villains. So I would recommend this book. You don't absolutely have to have read The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic. If you're not going to though, maybe like read the wiki page on Rincewind, the main character, just to sort of help you out. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars because it still hasn't completely broken away from the overly high fantasy elements of Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic, which I discussed in my review of those books. Next up was Eric, also by Terry Pratchett, and just plain old Eric is the US title. I think if you get it in the UK, and I'm not sure about Australia, the title is Faust crossed out Eric, so maybe look for it under that name if you can't find it. This was also a reread. It was also better than I remembered. It's a bit chaotic. The book basically consists of like an introduction, 3 scenes, and a conclusion. That's why it's so short, and its font is so huge. But the sort of thread tying those all together is stronger than I remembered. And the places that we go in this one are kind of more interesting than the places that we'd gone in the previous Rincewind novels. The Rincewind sub-series is sort of used to explore Discworld and provide satirical commentary on global cultures. And in Eric, we hit up the ancient Greeks and the Maya or Aztecs and Hell, which I guess is not really a global culture, but you know. And those ones are more interesting to me than like Egypt, Turkey, which we went to in Sourcery, and random island people where we were in Color of Magic. So Eric got the highest rating of all the Discworld novels so far, which is 4 out of 5 stars. Next book was The Seas by Samantha Hunt. I read this as part of the Underhyped Reads Readathon. It had only like 515 ratings on Goodreads, which is totally unfair. It is amazing. I am going to give it its own review, which I will link up eventually once I have done it. But you need to read this book. It was beautiful. It wasn't even like my type of thing. It's like contemporary American crazy people, which if you just told me about, I would say no. But this book was awesome and 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished was Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. This is a bit of a funky situation. I was creating an audiobook for LibriVox of Agnes Grey. So I started like last year getting through like a chapter a month approximately. I was going kind of lamely slow. But I finished Agnes Grey. It has now been posted on the LibriVox website. I will provide a link so that if you would like to have me read Agnes Grey to you for free, that's an option. And Agnes Grey is like such an adorbs book. You almost wouldn't even guess that it's a Bronte novel. There's no gothic elements. It's just like nice, happy romance. Sometimes people are mean, but you know, if you are good in your soul, you can get through that and stuff. So yeah, Agnes Grey got 4 out of 5 stars. And then the final thing that I finished this month was The Princess and the Pea, A Very Short Tale by Diane Setterfield. They're not kidding about very short. It was like 8 pages. and not totally sure why it existed. It was a pretty basic retelling of The Princess and the Pea with like smidge of a twist. I was really expecting more from this because Diane Setterfield's first novel, The 13th Tale, is about a writer who wrote a book called 13 Tales of Change and Destruction, I think, which are like fairy tales that get twisted and ugly. So I thought it might be twisted and ugly, but not. So bummer. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars just because it seemed too cruel to give it 2 stars, because it wasn't like trying to be great. It was trying to be small, and it succeeded. So that is what I read this month. Let's look forward into February. I'm currently reading 3 books. They are Interesting Times by Terry Pratchett, the next Rincewind novel, The Somnambulist by Essie Fox, and I'm listening to a really well done LibriVox audiobook, which I will link below, of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, because I got into that Bronte mood thanks to Agnes Grey. So of course I'm going to continue with the Terry Pratchett series, reading The Last Continent and the next book, The Last Hero. And The Last Hero is quite free of words for the most part. Not a lot of words going on. So I suspect I can get through both of these and then start Unseen Academicals, which is a Romeo and Juliet adaptation, sort of, in addition to being about soccer. It's awesome. So I'm not going to get to this by Valentine's Day. Crap. But maybe I can get to it in the month of February. And that is the last book in the Rincewind sub-series, so that's a milestone in my Read All of Discworld's project. Other books that I want to read this month are, well, maybe want is not the right term. I'm going to read Rumplestiltskin by K.M. Shea, and then hate myself afterwards. This does mean that I will do a review of it, and I will talk about K.M. Shea. I will do it. But I can't yet. And also, Princess and the Pea makes me want to read some good Diane Setterfield, so I feel like it is time for a reread of The 13th Tale. Now, I actually physically read this with my eyeballs quite a few years ago. Then I got the audiobook and I listened to that several times, but it's an abridged audiobook. Why would anyone make one of those? So there's some scenes where I'm like, I kind of remember that happened, but I need a refresher. So until they make an unabridged audiobook, I guess I will have to actually use my eyeballs and read this on paper. But it's amazing, so I don't mind. So let's take a look at how I'm doing on my bookish resolutions for 2015 up to this point. The first one was read 50 books, which, as I mentioned, I've changed to read 70 books in total, and since I've read 14, I am now 20% done with that goal. The next one was read the entire Discworld series. I have read the first 4 and started the 5th, and since I suck at math, I'm just trying to read one of the Discworld books every week, with one catch-up week per series. There's 40 books, there's 52 weeks, that roughly works out good enough for me, so I'm on track for that goal. Next one was to finish Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I have done, and then read 5 classic novels. I have read 4, 2 Hardys and 2 Brontes, so almost done with that one. I'm gonna call this a successful January. So do tell me what you read this month, whether you liked it, whether I should read it, and how you're doing on your goals so far this year. I will see you later.